The girl was 9 years old and standing in the cereal aisle of a Kroger supermarket in Chattanooga, Tennessee, on a Thursday afternoon in early September, and the way she looked at Calvin Reeves had nothing to do with the box of granola bars she was pretending to study. It had everything to do with the man standing 6 feet behind her, scrolling his phone with the studied casualness of someone trying very hard to appear uninterested, and the single sentence she mouthed at Calvin with the slow, deliberate precision of a child who had been practicing those words in her head for a very long time. Please don't let him take me. Calvin Reeves was 53 years old, a former Army logistics sergeant and current road captain for the Appalachian Iron MC out of Chattanooga, a club that had spent 12 years building playgrounds, raising money for the Veterans Affairs Hospital on Gun Barrel Road, and delivering Thanksgiving meals to families in the forgotten pockets of Hamilton County. He was a thick-set man with broad shoulders and a salt-and-pepper beard worn close, and he was wearing his black leather vest with the club patches because he'd come straight from a chapter meeting and hadn't thought to change before stopping for groceries. He was in aisle 7 reaching for a box of pasta when he noticed the girl. She was small for 9, with dark red hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, wearing a pink long-sleeve shirt that was too warm for the September heat outside, and jeans that had dried mud on one knee. Her sneakers were the kind that lit up when you stepped, the soles flashing faint red with each small shift of her weight. She was holding a box of granola bars against her chest, the way a person holds something when their hands need to be doing something or they'll shake. Her eyes were large and green and fixed on Calvin with an intensity that had no business existing in a grocery store cereal aisle on a Thursday afternoon. Calvin had done 3 tours. He had worked logistics in environments where reading a room correctly was the difference between going home and not going home. He knew the difference between a kid being shy and a kid being afraid. And he knew what controlled terror looked like when it was wearing a 9-year-old's face and trying very hard not to show itself. He read every visible detail in under 4 seconds, the way his training had hardwired him to do, and then he looked past her shoulder at the man positioned 6 feet behind her. The man was maybe 40, medium height, wearing a gray hoodie despite the warmth of the day, with light brown hair worn short and a face so carefully arranged into neutrality that the neutrality itself was the tell. His eyes were on his phone, but they were not moving the way eyes move when someone is actually reading something. They were scanning in small, controlled arcs, keeping track of the girl's position without appearing to keep track of it. And when Calvin's gaze landed on him directly, the man's thumb moved deliberately across his screen, and he shifted his weight half a step to the left, repositioning himself between the girl and the far end of the aisle, where a secondary exit sign glowed green above a door that led to the loading dock corridor. Calvin kept his own face perfectly still. He reached out and placed the pasta box in his basket with a movement so unhurried it communicated nothing at all to anyone watching. Then he took 2 measured steps toward the girl, stopping beside the shelf directly across from her, and crouched slightly to bring himself closer to her eye level without making the gesture conspicuous to anyone observing from a distance. He kept his voice under a murmur, barely above the ambient hum of the store's refrigeration units, and told her he was just a man shopping for groceries and that she could answer him one time as quietly as she needed to, and that whatever she said, he was going to believe her. Then he asked her if the man behind her was someone she knew. Her answer came in a breath so controlled it barely disturbed the air between them. She said she did not know him. She said he had approached her in the parking lot while she was putting the cart back for her mother, who was loading bags into their car 2 spaces over, and that he had told her mother had sent him inside to get her because she'd forgotten her phone at the register. She said she had followed him in because it sounded true. She didn't want to be difficult. But then he had steered her away from the registers when she pointed toward them, and away from the customer service counter when she drifted toward it, and she'd been trying to find someone to tell for 11 minutes, and every time she got close to a store employee or another shopper, he found a reason to redirect her. Her voice stayed level through all of it with the terrifying steadiness of a child who understood at some instinctive level that breaking down in this moment was a luxury she could not afford. Calvin placed a box of crackers in his basket and straightened up slowly. He told her in that same barely audible register that she was going to walk beside him toward the front of the store and that she should not look back at the man and that he was not going to leave her side. Then he shifted the basket to his left hand, freeing his right, and dialed 911 with the phone held low against his thigh, lifting it to his ear only when the dispatcher picked up. He spoke quietly, but with the precision of a man who had spent years giving coordinates and manifests and situation reports in environments where accuracy was everything, identifying himself by full name, giving his location as the Kroger on Hickson Pike in Chattanooga, describing a possible child abduction in progress, a white male adult in a gray hoodie, approximately 40 years of age, 5 feet 10, light brown hair, who had separated a minor female from her parent in the parking lot using a false pretext and was currently attempting to prevent the child from reaching store staff or exiting to find her mother. The dispatcher's voice sharpened the way dispatcher voices do when the information lands correctly. She told him units were being dispatched and asked him to keep the child with him and to remain visible to store cameras if possible. He said he understood. He asked Lily her last name, and she told him it was Warwick. He asked her if her mother was still outside, and she said she thought so, that her mom didn't know yet, that she hadn't had a chance to scream or run because every time she thought about it, the man was too close, and she was afraid of what he would do. Calvin told her she had done everything right. He told her that asking a stranger for help was exactly the right decision, and that she had picked the right stranger. They were moving through the baking aisle toward the front when Calvin heard the footsteps behind them shift. The man had been trailing at a distance calibrated to look incidental, but something had changed in his read of the situation. Perhaps Calvin's posture, perhaps the phone pressed to his ear, perhaps the way Lily had stopped drifting and started walking with purpose. Whatever it was, the trailing footsteps accelerated into something that was not yet running, but was no longer pretending to be casual, and Calvin turned fully around and put his body between Lily and the man without any theater about it. The basket still hanging from his left arm, his right hand free, his feet shoulder-width apart in the stance of a man who has stood between things before. He said in a voice calibrated not for volume, but for weight that the man needed to stop where he was. It was not a suggestion. It carried the register of a command delivered by someone who had given commands in conditions where hesitation had consequences, and it landed in the aisle the way such things land, with a silence that the refrigeration hum could not quite fill. The man stopped. His face moved through 3 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds. The first was surprise at being addressed directly. The second was a rapid calculation behind the eyes, assessing exits, assessing the size of the obstacle in front of him, assessing the phone visible in Calvin's hand and what it probably meant. The third expression was a decision, and before Calvin could speak again, the man turned and moved fast toward the far end of the aisle, cutting left through the paper goods section toward the pharmacy entrance at the store's side, a door that opened not onto the main parking lot, but onto a narrow strip of asphalt that ran behind the attached strip mall and connected to a service road that fed back out to Hickson Pike without passing through any of the main traffic cameras. Calvin had cataloged that door when he walked in. Old habit from years of working in environments where knowing your exits was not optional. He kept Lily close and moved to maintain a line of sight on the man while pulling up the last message in his chapter group text. He typed 2 words and hit send. Side door. Because when he had pulled into the Kroger lot 40 minutes earlier, 4 members of the Appalachian Iron MC had been pulling in behind him, planning to follow him 2 blocks over to the hardware store where the chapter was sourcing lumber for a playground project at an elementary school in East Ridge. 4 bikes were parked in the far row of that lot. Their riders had been leaning on fenders, arguing about whether pressure-treated pine was worth the price difference, the way riders argue when they have nothing urgent to do, which meant that by the time the man in the gray hoodie hit the horizontal bar on the pharmacy exit door and stepped out into the narrow side lot, he walked into a wall of leather that had not been there 60 seconds before. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be described later by the responding Chattanooga Police Department officers as one of the most effective civilian containment situations they had encountered in the district, and it had been accomplished without a single act of physical aggression, without a raised fist or a grabbed collar, through nothing more than the deliberate placement of 4 large men and 4 motorcycles between one person and every available direction of escape. Darnell, who went by Church in the chapter, and who was the largest of the 4 at 6 feet 4 and 260 pounds of former offensive lineman, had positioned himself at the end of the narrow lot closest to the service road the moment the text came through. Hector, road name Flint, had moved his bike to block the gap between the building's corner and the dumpster enclosure. The other two, brothers named Warren and Pete, who had ridden together for 9 years, took up positions at the lot's north edge, where a low concrete barrier separated the asphalt from the strip mall's rear access lane. None of them touched the man. None of them needed to. They simply occupied the space between him and every exit with the unhurried certainty of people who were not going to move, and the man in the gray hoodie stopped in the middle of that narrow lot and looked at the geometry of what surrounded him and understood that running was no longer a viable calculation. He tried words first, the way people do when physicality has been removed as an option. He said he didn't know what anyone thought was happening, but that he had just been shopping and had nothing to do with any child. Church looked at him without expression and said that was fine, and that he was welcome to explain that to the police who were currently on their way. The man tried indignation next, raising his voice slightly, and Flint looked up from where he was leaning against his bike and said that raising his voice was not going to change the geometry of the situation and that he might as well conserve the energy. The man went quiet after that. He stood in the center of the lot with his hands at his sides and his jaw tight and his eyes moving between the 4 bikers and the door he had come through. And he did not move again. Inside the store, Calvin had walked Lily to the customer service counter and asked the woman behind it to call the store manager immediately and to make an announcement over the intercom for a woman named Mrs. Warwick to come to customer service. He kept himself positioned between Lily and the store's interior, watching the aisle they had come from, while Lily stood beside him gripping the strap of her own jacket with both hands. The granola bars she'd been holding finally set down on the counter, because she no longer needed something to keep her hands from shaking. The worst of it was over, and her body was beginning to understand that. The announcement had barely finished echoing through the store when a woman came around the corner of the wine aisle at a pace that was not quite running but was everything a person can do without running. A woman in her mid-30s with the same dark red hair as Lily, wearing a Kroger tote bag over one shoulder, and an expression on her face that Calvin recognized from his years in service as the expression of someone who has been afraid for long enough that relief, when it arrives, looks almost identical to collapse. She saw Lily behind the counter and stopped walking and put both hands over her mouth, and Lily crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and pressed her face into her mother's shoulder. And the woman named Mrs. Warwick folded around her daughter and held her in the specific way that people hold things they thought they had lost. Her name was Diane Warwick. She was a pediatric occupational therapist who had moved to Chattanooga from Knoxville 2 years earlier after her divorce, and she had been searching the parking lot for Lily for 6 minutes before coming back inside, her mind doing the terrible arithmetic of possibilities, her phone already in her hand to dial 911 when the intercom announcement reached her. She told Calvin all of this later, sitting in the store manager's office waiting for the police to finish their initial interviews, her voice steady in the way that voices are steady when the steadiness is costing something. She said she had turned her back for 45 seconds, maybe less, to lift a bag of dog food into the trunk, and when she turned around, Lily was walking toward the store entrance with a man Diane had never seen before, and by the time she processed what she was seeing and called out, they were already through the automatic doors. She looked at Calvin across the small office table and said she did not know how to say what she needed to say, that thank you felt inadequate for the specific category of thing he had done, and Calvin told her she didn't need to find the right words, because there weren't any words sized correctly for moments like this one, and that was all right. He said Lily had done the hard part. He said her daughter had kept herself calm in a situation that would have unraveled most adults, had read the environment clearly, had identified the right moment and the right person, and had communicated everything he needed to know in 6 words without making a sound that the man behind her could hear. He said Diane had raised someone remarkable. Lily was sitting beside her mother with a cup of apple juice the store manager had produced from somewhere, and she looked up at Calvin when he said that with the particular expression of a child receiving a truth rather than a compliment, something she intended to keep rather than deflect. She said she had tried to get help from 2 other people before him. She said she had drifted close to a woman in the produce section and tried to make eye contact, and the woman had looked through her. She said she had moved toward a teenage store employee's stocking shelves near the dairy case, and the man had steered her away before she got within speaking distance. She said she had been counting people and trying to find the right one, and when she saw Calvin's vest with the patches, she thought he looked like someone who would not look through her, like someone who would actually see her standing there. Calvin was quiet for a moment after she said that. Then he told her that she had been correct, and that he was glad she had trusted that instinct, and that the instinct to keep trying even after two people didn't see her was the thing that had made all the difference. The man in the gray hoodie was identified by Chattanooga PD as Gerald Foss, 41 years old, with a prior arrest in Bradley County on charges related to the attempted enticement of a minor, a case that had resulted in a plea agreement and probation rather than incarceration. His probation had expired 8 months before the Kroger incident, and he had not reoffended within the system's visibility until that Thursday afternoon in September. The detectives who processed his arrest told Calvin privately that the prior case had involved a parking lot and a similar false pretext about a parent sending him, that it was a practiced approach, and that Lily's instinct to keep looking for the right adult rather than comply with the man's redirection had almost certainly prevented a situation that the detectives declined to describe in specific terms, but that Calvin understood completely. The Appalachian Iron MC was not in the habit of seeking recognition for the things they did. They fixed playgrounds and drove veterans to medical appointments and showed up when floods hit the low-lying neighborhoods along the Tennessee River. And they did those things because their patches meant something to them, and because the community they lived in was the community they had chosen to protect. But the Kroger incident, as it came to be called within the chapter, became something they talked about differently from their other work, not as an achievement, but as a reminder. Church said it plainly at the next chapter meeting, sitting at the long table in the clubhouse with his coffee going cold in front of him, that the whole thing had started because one man had been paying attention in a grocery store aisle on a Thursday afternoon when he could have been looking at his phone like everyone else, and that the difference between paying attention and not paying attention was the difference between Lily Warwick going home that night and not going home. The chapter started a program 3 months later, in partnership with the Hamilton County School District, a 10-session workshop they called Eyes Open, taught in middle school gymnasiums and community centers across the county. The curriculum covered the specific mechanics of how strangers approach children in public settings, the language and pretexts most commonly used, and the practical techniques children could employ to signal for help without alerting a nearby threat. Calvin taught the section on how to identify a safe stranger in a crowd. He told students to look for someone who was paying attention to their surroundings rather than their phone, someone whose body language communicated presence rather than distraction. And then he told them what Lily had told him in the manager's office, that she had looked for someone who seemed like they would actually see her. In the first year of the program, 1,100 students went through the curriculum. In the second year, a girl in a Red Bank middle school used techniques from the workshop to safely signal a librarian when a man who had been following her through the stacks made contact. In the third year, a 10-year-old boy in East Brainerd used the safe stranger identification method at a gas station when a woman tried to convince him her car had broken down and she needed him to help her look for something in the trunk. Both situations were resolved without harm. Both children went home. Lily Warwick came to the program's second-year anniversary event at a community center in North Chattanooga. She was 11 by then, taller, her red hair cut differently, wearing a jacket with a small enamel pin on the lapel that she had bought herself. She sat in the front row while Calvin spoke to a gymnasium full of students and parents, and at the end of the presentation, she raised her hand when he asked if anyone in the room had ever needed to ask a stranger for help. She stood up in front of all those people and told her story in a clear voice that did not waver, the parking lot and the false pretext, and the two people who had not seen her, and the man in the leather vest in the cereal aisle who had crouched down to her level and told her he was going to believe whatever she said. She said the most important thing she had learned was not a technique or a method, but a fact, which was that asking for help works, that there are people in ordinary places on ordinary days who are paying attention, and that the act of keeping her eyes open and her fear managed long enough to find one of those people was something she had done herself, with her own courage, and that no one could take that from her. Calvin stood at the side of the gymnasium and listened to this 11-year-old girl tell a room full of strangers what she had learned about the world. And he thought about the 4 seconds in a grocery store aisle when everything had turned on the decision to look up from a basket of pasta and actually see what was in front of him. He thought about how many times a day people move through public spaces with their attention folded inward, how the ordinary texture of a busy store or a crowded parking lot trains the eye to slide past the details that don't fit, how a child standing too still in a cereal aisle can become invisible inside all that ordinary noise unless someone has made a prior decision, deliberate and private and unremarkable to anyone watching, to keep their eyes open and their instincts trusted. He thought about the granola bars Lily had been holding against her chest to keep her hands from shaking. He thought about the 6 words she had mouthed across a grocery store aisle to a stranger in a leather vest because he looked like someone who would not look through her. He thought about how she had been right. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who spends time in public spaces with children, someone who drops kids off at school or takes them to the store, or sits in waiting rooms and parking lots and all the ordinary places where ordinary things happen, and occasionally something does not fit. Because the difference between a story that ends well and one that does not is almost never dramatic or loud. It is almost always quiet and small, and it depends entirely on whether one person in the right place at the right moment was paying enough attention to see a child who needed to be seen.